Welcome to our March Music Forum. I'm Robert Taub, Music Director of the Arts Institute, University of Plymouth. Great to be with you all. And it's also a pleasure to have with me via Zoom from New York City, our guest, Jonathan Dawe, composer. John is one of the most imaginative, creative, compelling, and truly artistic composers now or of any time. Recent work includes a big orchestral piece that was commissioned and performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. This is a major event. Also, operas in Montreal and New York. John and I have collaborated on several projects, including a piano concerto that he composed that we premiered together at Michigan State University. I don't know how he does it, but when he's not composing, he also finds time to be a long-term member of the graduate studies faculty at the Juilliard School in New York. In the last year, we at the Arts Institute have been honored to commission John to compose a new work for our Beethoven 250 celebration, which is now scheduled for autumn 2021. And there's an opportunity to hear John's music live here in Plymouth before then. We also commissioned him, along with composer Jane O'Leary, to write the musical score for Some Call It Home, our multimedia music drama that's part of the Mayflower 400 commemorations. That work, Some Call It Home, has just been rescheduled for performances in Theatre Royal Plymouth on the lyric stage on Friday the 4th of June and Saturday the 5th of June. So in our music forum today, John will be offering us previews of these two new works and discussing how he makes the kind of musical decisions that he does when creating a new piece. But first, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to John. We're very pleased to have you with us, John. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be here. Thank you. And I'm glad to see you. I'm reminded of our musical adventures of the past. And those were good times. Hope things are well in Plymouth for you.
Thanks, John. They are well. And you're right. We had plenty of musical adventures, and we're having more, which is part of the good fun. But one of the things that I always wonder about as a performer is how do composers make the decisions that they make? In a certain sense, you're facing a blank page. I know there are 5 lines, there's a staff system and all that. But where do you put the black dots? What kind of decisions does a composer make? Whether it's a composer from the past like Beethoven, or whether it's someone a living composer like you.
Yeah.
So let me turn it over to you. What do you do when you're confronted with a blank page of sheet music?
Well, now it's a loaded question. I think a lot of us composers are always really dealing and grappling with the compositional process and how we, from beginning to end, will complete a composition. I still feel that for me, composing is one of the most difficult things I know how to do. And so with the idea of how you begin composing itself is not so tricky, I think, when you begin, but really the idea of how do you take a piece to completion can be a formidable task. And one that I think, at least in my case, I'm still grappling with in how we do this. One of the areas I think that I've noticed in my own development as a composer, and also working with other composers and younger composers, is that there often is a real challenge, a tactic when you begin with a more local type of idea as you begin to compose. That usually is not so difficult to sit down and to write a tune, a melody, a motive, or an idea. And that can be quite enjoyable. But we also know that has to really kind of form into an overall gestalt or an architecture. And that also is not difficult to do, to sit down and say, well, now I'm going to have the piece do that. And I can imagine, later on, it's going to be more of a cantabile moment. And then I'm going to have a, big finale at the end. And I can imagine it all. But really making those two areas link together, the two dimensions of the local, if I can call it that, and the large scale, well, that can be really difficult, very difficult. To have a type of organic growth from those original ideas that will create that form that you imagined. Or if you work in the other direction, to begin with that type of form and then to fill it in a way that gives you the type of motion that you are hoping to have. a real sense of narrative from beginning to end in doing that.
Well, that's interesting that you use the word narrative. When you write a piece of music, I imagine it depends to a certain extent on the genre and what you're trying to accomplish with a specific piece at hand. But is there an extra musical narrative from time to time? I imagine with an opera, there's got to be. What about with a string quartet?
Well, there can be any sense of things that will bring you through from one beginning to end. Narrative is an interesting word. I've noticed in music it's used quite a bit, and it's even formalized into an area called narratology, where you deal with these things, and often they will touch upon extra musical ideas. I remember, I think it was in 2011, maybe, I wrote an organ piece. It was a crazy piece, and it was for the organist Joseph Arndt, and he performed it. And I remember we went out to Newark for the premiere, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what you're doing at all in that composition, but somehow I think I got the narrative of it. And I was, I enjoyed that very much. But this idea of logically having a type of contiguous motion from one idea to the other. I mean, there's no doubt that one thing that really helped me in that area was a type of direction I went in the early mid 1990s, when I was still a graduate student at Juilliard and I was working with Milton Babbitt. And we were dealing with a lot of things together. He was really a wonderful teacher, I know, for so many young composers. But one area that I really was drawn to was something that was becoming more and more popular, not so much in music, but in the visual arts and in physics and mathematics, and that's fractal geometry. And so from that time on, this notion of fractal geometry and fractals and how they can manifest and be thought of not just in the domain of art and mathematics, but in an art form that unfolds in time, being music, is something that I've really been spending a tremendous amount of time and happy energy, in dealing with.
That sounds interesting. I know that you have spoken a little bit about this to me privately before, about fractals, and you've used it in some of the compositions that that I know of, that you've crafted previous to art to today. I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe you could sort of describe the multi-dimensional sense in which you use fractals. Maybe you could define it for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us today have some involvement or knowledge or experience of what a fractal is. If we could maybe see the first slide with regard to that. A fractal deals with several different items. One, of course, is going to be repetition. So if we're looking at the first slide here, the idea of a triangle, and one can see how that triangle has been repeated in such a way to create a different type of formation, but all of those contours are being made from the repetition of that triangle. But in addition to that, an important idea of fractals is the idea of scaling. So it's not going to be simply a triangle, but you will have repetitions of triangles that will be at different sizes, if you will. And that's an important aspect of fractals as well. But then finally, another significant idea of fractals is that you simply do not have repetition, because repetition itself is not a fractal, but the idea that the repetition or the recurrence of that pattern or shape at different sizes or scalings will be manifest within itself. So if we could look at the next slide, which is a fern, we see how we have a type of fern shape that we have, which will then create a larger fern shape. So the larger fern leaf is made up of smaller leaves, and then we have the largest one of all. Of course, fractals are manifest in nature, and that's one of the things that really attracted the real pioneer of fractal geometry, Benoit Mandelbrot, to this idea of noticing that these types of recursions did exist in in nature. If we look at the next slide, number 3, we have a tempting piece of Romanesque broccoli here, but also we can see the idea of the shapes that are manifest. So the recursion needs to somehow be intrinsic to the design, and not only intrinsic, but that really every part of the contour of that shape deals with the idea of the repetition that you have. Um, One interesting area of making the connection between fractals and music is that we often think about these ideas of recursive shapes and how they can be folded in to one another, and how that could work in music. Of course, we have repetition in music all the time, but that doesn't necessarily make a fractal. The idea is that you have to have this deep kind of organic manifestation of how it always works together. And it's interesting in the significant work, the fractal geometry of nature of Mandelbrot. He mentioned something which really kind of caught my attention early on, in which he himself, would state that there might seem to be a strong connection between these fractals ideas in mathematics, in physics, in art, in architecture, and music, but this is actually a superficial type of connection. And so how to actually create this idea of manifest recursion in music, this is a tricky one. And so if we could look at the final slide of this first series here, one can get a sense, even if one is unfamiliar with musical notation, you can see how the idea of that can be replicated, how a basic 3-note idea, each one of those notes then can be the starting point for the next note that unfolds together on one on another. I have to mention that, again, we're dealing with metaphors for music, because the very idea that pitch goes up and down and that pitch unfolds in time on the horizontal, that's a metaphor too. That's not really, I think, what's going on, but it's not a bad place to start. So we could leave the slides right now.
There's another thought, and that is, and I know that you sort of deal with this all the time, and that is the relationship between the flow, the tempo, so to speak, on the surface, and the underlying rate of harmonic change, the harmonic rhythm, so to speak. And the two can be vastly different. How does that relate in any architectural sense to?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I fully understand, but you are bringing to mind a problem with regard to musical fractals. I mean, when you look at an image of a fractal, boom, your eyes take it in right away. You can see all of these levels of recursion occurring in different states. But how do you do that in music without having a type of repetition that will become tedious? If I were to show you a picture of a fractal, but only show you one level at a time, after a while, you'd say, yeah, I got it, enough. And so there are interesting ways to deal with that with regard to counterpoint, polyphony, and controlling the rate of the repetition. Of course, this all is in the field of composition and compositional choices that you make. One final thing that I'll mention that I do think is really interesting, a mathematician who might be watching this might, shout foul and say, no, you really haven't defined a fractal yet. What really makes a fractal is the contour and the measuring of an irregular shape, as opposed to a Euclidean shape that is going to have a very clear type of a dimension. A fractal shape is going to have a fractal dimension or a Hausdorff dimension. If you look at a straight line and you will zoom in on it at a particular rate, let's say each time you get half and half and half, your measurement will cut in half each time. But with a fractal, if you look at that shape, each time you zoom into it, let's say I zoom in a little more, the actual detail that you will get will be far more. And so the idea, again, of viewing music as having a rough contour, which is the term that Mandelbrot always used, is a really kind of provocative one. I remember once in a class at Juilliard, we actually looked at a line of Bach. It was a second Brandenburg concerto, and we worked out its fractal dimension. There are ways to do this. We did box counting, and we wanted to figure out the fractal dimension of Bach. It was an experimental type of thing, but I remember we got down to one point where, we had a 30-second note. How will you go even deeper in between notes? And it was a very compelling moment. One student raised a hand and said overtones. The idea that, every pitch has a type of hidden spectrum of sound. It's not a crazy idea. And then finally, one other student raised their hand and said emotion. And of course, that seemed a fitting place to conclude the class. But this is maybe a topic for a different time, but an interesting one.
John, let's get to some music. Do you have a couple of clips to play for us?
Yeah. One thing that I did develop rapidly, I think, when getting into the idea of fractal geometry and the idea of beginning with a musical idea and growing it larger and larger, I noticed that if I took a type of atonal or a grouping of pitches that the audience might not be familiar with to begin with, if I grow it, well, I don't know, what are they going to hear if they didn't really know what I started with? So I became very interested in the idea of taking more archetypal bits of music from the past, music that had a type of commonality, and then grow that with these types of fractal procedures, which would create the very type of growth that might occur in nature. And I was drawn to do that, especially with not only fragments from Baroque music, but I was interested in the idea of tapping into what might be considered or called Baroque affect. These little musical ideas, which in the 18th century would have extra musical meaning. So if you consider, for example, an appoggiatura, which would, for anyone at the time, be a type of musical symbol for a lament or sorrow, what would happen if I grew that fractally? And so I developed the idea of creating a type of 21st century take on Baroque affect by really citing the different types of affect from joy to rage. And usually it'd be like a 3 or 4 note motive, and then growing it into something really quite wild. And then I think it was Bill Anderson of the Cygnus Ensemble who first coined the term fractal Baroque.
Yeah.
So this has been an area in which I've been dwelling. So if you look at the next slide set, some operas of the past would deal with these ideas. So there was my second opera, Cracter Orlando, Dramma per musici fractals. And then an interesting opera after that I wrote was Così faran tutti, which was actually a prequel to Mozart. It's really what happened the few days before. And there's a whole host of complexities that occur. And that work is interesting because I take fragments of Mozart, I grow them fractally, but I begin my opera at the most fractal moment. So in a sense, in the 90-minute opera, the fractals unwind in retrograde. And so we hear more and more Mozart, and then my opera actually, Così faran tutti, which means they'll all do it, will end with the actual Mozart. I would mention, we know that today that many operas are controversial with regard to content material, especially with regard to today's standards. One aspect of the prequel is that it's the women who actually exchange their identities and trick the men. So it's an interesting type of spin. And then finally, in the third slide that we have, is an interesting work in which I combine a libretto of a lost Handel opera, Nero, Love Obtained by Blood and Murder. And in my version, I've transformed it into Nero and the Fall of Lehman Brothers. And this is an interesting type of morphine, which is something that I do quite often. I was able to track down, like Indiana Jones, the libretto of this lost Handel opera, extract lines from it, create an entirely new storyline based upon the fall of Lehman Brothers in 2008. And then the balance of the material of the text will be from actual historical narrative of the time. One of the lines is a great aria for Nero, in which the line is, don't get that, I'm soft. I'm really soft, but what I really want to do is reach in and rip out their hearts and eat it before they die. I know we need some help, but the bros always win. That's Dick Fold who actually said that. And so that public statement I turned into an aria. Maybe we could hear some of the music right now. I think there's some YouTube links. So actually, the first that we're going to hear, let's go back to Cracked Orlando. And this is just segments from the finale. And I'll say very quickly what you'll hear is an aria in which I take some of the fragments of Handel and Vivaldi, and I actually work out the overtones of those. So you'll hear the opera in the upper partials. And even if that's not quite clear what I'm doing, I hope my hand motions give some sense. And then the final bit of the opera, there'll be a 3-note affect, which will then be repeated. So hopefully you'll hear that. This is actually Mary Mackenzie, Hai Ting Chin, Kareem Suleiman, and Anthony Roth Costanzo playing Orlando. The libretto is a fractal libretto too by Terry Marks Tarlow, Ryan McAdams conducting, and also Company 14, the dance company. So the tail end live at the Italian Academy. This was about 10 years ago. Cracked Orlando. So you hear at the end there's a lot of motives. What happens at the beginning of the opera, we hear it just as a 4-note idea, and then that will grow and grow and grow. And what's interesting is that the librettist, Terry Marks Tarlow, is a doctor psychiatrist who actually uses fractals in her own treatment. And she wrote a fractal libretto that grows by the Fibonacci sequence. Things get larger and larger, so it worked out. why don't we just move ahead? The next example I think that we have is from Nero and the Fall of Lehman Brothers. And this was a production that took place up in Montreal with the innovative opera company BOP, Ballet Opera Pantomime. And this is just the opening of Act 2. And again, as I'd mentioned, the entire libretto, if not from the my attempted translation of the archaic German from Handel, is from the actual narrative. And there was a very famous line by the ex-CEO of Citibank, Chuck Prince. It's a well-known line with regard to what led up to the financial debacle. And he says, as long as the music is playing, we're going to get up and dance. And it really was kind of misquoted with the idea that there was a party going on all the time with regard to these investment bankers. And I found it very interesting as I was doing the research and read a lot in putting the libretto together. That's not really what he had intended. He says, as long as that music is going on, we have to get up and dance, with the idea that, with this leverage, we're puppets here. We have to do this. And so here we see the opening of Act 2. They're all hungover. There was a scene that happened at the end of Act 1, but I won't go into that now. But anyway, it led to the type of scene we see here. And they're singing this idea of how they just need to get back to trading. One of the really innovative things with regard to the BOP production is that they reconstructed an entire trading floor. And in a sophisticated way, in the style of the 1980s, like The Wolf of Wall Street. So there was a weird, subtle play there. And the actual performers were bankers, and their music was actually on computer screens. And you'll see it's in Montreal, so the ticker tape becomes the subtitles that we have. The three bankers here are Matt Boiler, Bruno Roy, Arthur Tanguay-Lebros, and it's conducted by Hubert Tanguay-Lebros.
So sorry I'm late. Would you guys meet me at my desk? Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Oh my God. The most important part of the job. Guys, it's a big day. Oh, here we go. Guys, let's go. Late night. Right. Get it together. Get to work. No, we're balling. Fuck shit! We must dance, We must all
John, that's an enormous contrast between the two, stylistically on the surface, it seems.
Right. I mean, one thing I'll mention in Nero, there are very little references to music of the past. This happens to be one of them. I'll just mention that there are fragments from the opening of Bach's St. John Passion. I don't need to go into the implications of why I chose that for the beginning of what's going on here. But increasingly, I have moved away from dealing with actual artifacts and focusing more on the fractal process. And so the music that I'm dealing with now in the most recent opera I've done, Beering Ariodante, there really are no references to music of the past directly. But that was important for me when I was doing that I had some type of artifact that had a type of lineage to it, because I really felt there was a lot that I was doing with regard to the compositional process that I just enjoyed having that a bit of material from the past. And, these are unique things because often I would hear a piece of music, and I'm not talking about Bach, but maybe another less known Baroque composer. And I would be most excited about not what I heard, but what I didn't hear. And all of us composers were kind of twisted in the world in which we live. And so I really kind of would hear these things and want to finish the works, as it were. So ironically, with regard to the direction I'm going now, which is really quite different, the string quartet, which is my fifth string quartet, which you've commissioned, does deal with quite a few artifacts, but in a rather interesting way.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I'd love to hear how that's different yet again. Before we get into that, I just would like to remind everyone that there's an opportunity to ask questions via the email that's on the screen from, comes across on the banner. So don't hesitate to pose a question for John or for us that we'd be glad to address at the conclusion of our conversation. So John, we have an enormous musical year that's sort of upon us, and has been upon us, and will continue for a little while. And that is the 250th anniversary of the birth of Beethoven in 1770. So as when I asked you to consider a commission that was, I don't know whether it was different from other things that you've done, but the idea for me was a little bit different. We all are aware, and we've discussed previously in some of our University of Plymouth events, that Beethoven was an obsessive sketcher. He had literally thousands of pages of sketches by the time he had died, and despite the fact that he moved something like 24 times in 23 years in Vienna, or whatever it was, the sketchbooks that he brought with him as a young man from Bonn, where he was able to have at his fingertips, toward the end of his life. So he took sketching very seriously. Some works you can trace from the sketchbooks, in some senses, you can trace at least segments of those works to the finished offering, the finished autograph score, even a published version. Right. The last string quartet that Beethoven wrote, Opus 135, is somewhat of an example of that. Not all sketches made it into the final work, and the work is comprised of pieces of music that were not previously sketched, but there is some union of the two, if you think of it as a Venn diagram. So if I can recall correctly, what I asked was whether you'd be interested in taking a sketch that Beethoven prepared or thought about or some musical material that Beethoven sketched for Opus 135. Would that inspire you to write your own string quartet using that as a germ of an idea?
Yeah, and I got to tell you, it was a tricky task at hand, because in a lot of ways it was just too dull for me to deal with. It was really the kind of thing that I'd done before, but it clearly intrigued me. You're exactly right with the sketches. And from what I understand, Beethoven would get up early, he would compose in the morning, and then he'd go for these long walks, and he often would sketch at that time. Often the sketches were not the type of working out of ideas, but just little jottings to remind himself of what he had composed before or thought of. So they could be absolutely illiterate with regard to what's going on. I would mention that with regard to Mozart as well. We often think that Mozart just boom right from the brain, but no, Mozart did sketch as well. And some of them are really quite awful. I say that only in that they weren't meant to be, he was clearly working in shorthand. And you can also see why Mozart often abandoned a work, because it just didn't work out. But Beethoven clearly was sketching a lot. But I quickly concocted an interesting idea, because the final string quartet, Opus 135, was going to be performed on this event at this festival. And so I like the idea of working with Beethoven sketches in such a way that I would take those sketches, which later or during the process would eventually become that music which was used in the Beethoven quartet. And so I would begin with a primitive sketch as that artifact. I would, with a certain type of fractal process, which I'll mention in a moment, begin to grow it. Along the way, I would have plenty of moments of pure Dawe come out. And then at the last moment, I would have that transform into just that chess move before the actual Beethoven. with the idea that you hear the sketchbook in a way come to life, and not just playing the notes of the sketchbook, but having a real, kind of manifestation of 21st century music as well. Interesting to note, we would think in this day and age that all of the sketches would be available with the click of a Google button, but it really wasn't. And I spent months trying to track down the sketches, and I really couldn't find anything. It really wasn't that, not all of the sketches are published and available. And so I really had to go into a type of, Indiana Jones mode here with my hat and whip and look for these. And finally, in a dissertation, I think from the 1960s by Catherine Bumpus, and with help from Jane Gottlieb, the Juilliard Library, were able to track down a dissertation that had them all. And so I was able to get all of the sketches and work from them.
Well, that's good. And the idea of, I can imagine a fantasy in which Beethoven comes back to life and hears the performance of 135, but before that he hears his sketches as a point of inspiration for your piece. Maybe we can.
Maybe we're lucky at that point he couldn't really hear, because I don't know what he'd make of it. But the 135 is an interesting piece. He really, I think, was thinking of it being a much larger work. And if you look at the sketches, he was really trying to make it this magnus opus with regard to counterpoint, the great counterpoint achievement. And it's interesting, if you think of the time, it was 1826.
Yeah.
So Schubert must have finished or about to finish his Ninth Symphony. And 1826 is when Fanny Mendelssohn wrote the Opus 8, the Song Without Words, which I think are significant pieces with regard to 19th century romantic ideas. So it's really interesting that he really is in this time period of the first generation of romantic composers. But it came up with a much shorter work. One thing that I do is I run of the sketches my piece backward, so that I begin with what would be the sketches for his final movement. Those come first in mind. And then by the time we get to the last part of my quartet, we really begin to hear that opening come to life. And so it ends, and then there's a break. Hopefully people don't boo, and then the Beethoven begins.
Oh, exactly.
Right.
So do you have some, I think you have some musical excerpts that you can share with us. Now, these are, I should make it explicitly clear that this piece has not yet been publicly performed. We have the Ruisi String Quartet coming for the final concert of our Beethoven Festival, the dates of which are the 30th of September, and then the 1st of October and the 2nd of October. So the Ruisi Quartet will be performing on the 2nd of October. They'll be playing Opus 59, number 1, and then your piece, and that'll be the premiere performance, and then Opus 135. So for our music forum this evening, John, I think you've put together some MIDI.
Yeah, but before we do that, let's get a little technical.
Good. Let's get technical.
It's the fifth quartet is what I'm calling it, but Laboratorium Artificium is the subtitle. And Laboratorium Artificium is a term that Beethoven himself once used in a letter to a friend, talking about where he composed, and meaning probably his really messy apartment. But it's a wonderful idea that it also was meant to be the kind of the psyche, the psychological world in which he composed as well. So I love that idea. If we could go to the final slideshow, I think it would be interesting to see how I concocted and how I created some of the growth of these sketches. So there's one area of fractal geometry that I've been really quite interested in, find quite compelling, and that's cellular automata. And cellular automata is the idea of having a particular cell that will have a type of behavior based on its neighbor. So if you imagine a type of grid, graph paper, if you will, you have one particular cell. And if we look at the first slide, we can see that right now on the very top. And the type of structuring you have on the bottom will depend on its neighborhood, depending on whether a space right below it has another cell or whether it's empty. And so you have a type of cellular growth that will emerge. So if you look at the very top square you can imagine you've got generations going down from each line that gets larger and larger. And the structure of that is all based on a particular type of code. Stephen Wolfram is one of these significant pioneers in this area. And one of the things that he finds quite compelling, and rightly so, is that by having a very basic type of algorithm or pattern, incredible irregularity can be created. At times, very clear patterns will be created, but at times the type of nuance of chaos that we have in the natural world will come into play. And so I use these types of ideas. If we go to the next slide, you can see the just some of the very different types of cellular growth pattern that can come out of this type of thinking. If we go to the third slide here, this is, I believe, Rule 90. I don't have it in front of me, but I can see a little bit of a picture. This is more of a symmetrical. Here you can actually see the type of fractal embedding of that pattern. And then if we go to the fourth slide, yet again, a different type of growth pattern that can occur. Now, you might wonder, how does one make music out of this? And there are many different ways to do this. Largely I deal with thinking about that original block that you have as a group of pitches. And then when you have the growth, then you'll have a type of canonic or a overlayering of that same material. If we go to slide number 5, even if you can't read music, I think you can get a sense from the visualization here of what's going on here, that we have an original 2-note motive that represents by the first block. Then if we've got 3 blocks, it's going to be that motive, the 2-note motive that will be presented 3 times in canon, or like a round, and then so forth. And these can be presented in any numbers of ways with regard to polyphony, with regard to different contractions of time. If you have a larger and larger growth occurring, often what I do is I take the original and I stretch it time-wise, so you get a very interesting sense of polyphony that is malleable, that is being shifted. If we go to the slide after that, this is actually from the Catherine Bumpus dissertation. I don't have any of the original in-hand Beethoven sketches, but just to give you an idea, these are some of the material from which I would apply these types of fractal workings. If we go to slide number 7, below that, again, another example. Slide number 8 will show clearly Beethoven thinking almost with regard to species counterpoint of the different types of things that he could work out that he actually never really did. And I'm really compelled by that, because I'd like to think, well, maybe I did it, not in the way that he would do it, not with his particular genius, but I was able to deal with a type of contrapuntal texture, the likes of which I would like to think would be my contribution. If we look at slide number 9, again, even if one is unfamiliar with musical notation, you can kind of see graphically the idea of the cellular growth that you would have here. And then the slide number 10, there is a 3-note motive in Beethoven, yada, you can see it right there, and you can see how it's been grown, how it's been overlapped, that would correspond to the idea of those particular type of growth patterns that you have. So.
Well, that's really, I mean, having the illustrations is extremely helpful. I'm wondering whether we can hear some of the MIDI excerpts at this point. I think they're.
Why don't we do that? And again, I'm done offering apologies and disclaimers with regard to electronic manifestations of what we're doing. We know that it will come to life with a Wheezy quartet playing, but I thought it would really just, to help advance the discussion, to have a little bit of examples that I really just took right off of my computer, and they're very short. So the first sound example we'll hear, there is one of the very first sketches that we have from Beethoven is like a repeated note, bum, 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 bum. And probably he got that from the canon. It was a kind of drinking song. That was probably the very first idea for the quartet. And so that will come early on in my offering. And so in the first example, you can hear how that basic repeated idea will grow. It will start sounding like Beethoven, but by the time we get to the end of it in 10 seconds, you can hear that it's moved into a very different sound world. Here's the first example. So it's not fair to just share a little example like that, but I think even there you can hear that bum, 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 bum is the original Beethoven sketch, and how that really will kind of take you into something that really doesn't sound like it's from the early 19th century anymore. Another example of that, I think this might be from the second part, but let's hear the second example. Yeah. So I know now, I remember now the Beethoven, there's a well-known to bum, 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 but I begin with another motive, with bum, bum, it was a 4-note motive. And through the repetition, it will begin to morph into yum, bum, 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 and so that will happen. And so throughout the quartet, I make these connections more and more audible from the original Beethoven sketch to a very different sound world. And then it will reappear as that new idea that actually makes it into the Opus 135. I'm increasingly interested in what I compose to really show that type of morphine, that type of process moving from one idea to the other. The slow movement of Beethoven is one of these wonderful kind of almost psychological dwellings where the terrain is a very type of not just melancholic, but you really feel that time is in a different place. And so with regard to my work, it probably is where we deviate the most from Beethoven. But there is a moment when I need to move into that final section of my work where the Beethoven really emerges, where I take a 3-note, 1, 2, 3, maybe a 4-note rising arpeggio from Beethoven, and I actually will very simply fractally plant it on each note of the next motive. And I'm delighted with the result. You really get this feeling of the music searching for Beethoven and trying to get out and back into the world of the early 19th century. Let's hear the example number 3. I'm very intrigued by some of these types of maneuverings when they don't simply take one into a non-tonal universe, but really a type of hypertonal. So in that rising sequence, there are multiple different keys that are suggested in a way that a composer of Beethoven's time would not consider. But I find that really compelling, a type of really, as a real postmodern idea, that type of idea, which comes from Beethoven, the four-note motive, will allude to many different keys and in a logical way. I was happy when I composed that. I remember dancing around in the apartment when I hit it.
Dancing around your Lehman Brothers laboratory.
That's right. And that will be contrasted, which happens in the final movement, where I actually take those cellular patterns and turn them into rhythms, which will then finally turn into Beethoven. So in the final section of my quartet, probably I make the longest journey from those cellular growth patterns to the actual Beethoven. So if we could hear the fourth example, this is the way my final section will begin. So I think at the end of that, we can really hear that Beethoven trying to pop out. And just a further example of that, if we hear the final example, this is closer to the end of the actual quartet. And then it goes on. So you can, if you know the opening of 135 of Beethoven, we hear rapidly the opening of that coming into focus. I apologize again for the sound quality, but I think we can all kind of hear through it and what's going on.
Yeah, John, it's very tantalizing, and it's in a way I was just reflecting personally. I was reflecting in the last example. I was reflecting on the notion that the fractals are sort of condensing back into a something that's the reverse of what an inversion of, in a sense.
I'm delighted you say that, because actually what happens in the last movement is it's all a retrograde. Yeah. So it does begin with all those types of Stravinsky type of those bossa nova beats that we hear are at the most complex with regard to the polyrhythms, and all of the fractals are the most distant with regard to the sound world of the Beethoven that comes. And you just hear the muscle of Beethoven pushing through. I would say that there's a surprise ending, which I won't give away, but it ends with a real wink and a drinking song, which I just gave it away. But anyway, there it is.
All right. Well, we'll wait with great anticipation for the actual premiere on the 2nd of October. Fantastic. Let's turn to
Sure.
a sort of upcoming event. 4th and 5th of June, we've got the first performances of Some Call It Home. You and Jane O'Leary collaborated on the musical score for that work. You know, we don't have a whole lot of time left this evening, so maybe we can just give a brief summary. The libretto for this multimedia music drama consists primarily of quotes that trace history from slightly pre-Pilgrim through the Pilgrim era in Pilgrim's Landing, through Westward Expansion, Manifest Destiny, Oppenheimer, famous quotation that, upon the successful explosion of the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert in 1945, and then we move on to some other surprises thereafter. So ending with some degree of optimism, but based on a dramatic conflict in philosophies. And so maybe you could give from your perspective, a brief overview of how you got to work on this, how you collaborated, and then I know that there's a video example that we'd like to play as well. So
At the very end, yes. Well, I mean, I think we should mention that it began with the notion of the celebration of the 400th year of Plymouth and the Pilgrims, and of course, we realized that we just didn't want to do something based on Pilgrims, so it's a much broader type of idea, dealing also with environmental awareness and of migration and a whole host of different types of topics, and some of them difficult topics.
right, and the crux for me was to come up with a topic that was true, relevant, and from which we could learn in 2020 or 2021 from events that happened 400 years ago. So the whole Mayflower commemoration is, wonderful. What can we take away from it? What can we learn from it?
Right. And so with regard to it's almost an oratorio that goes through different time periods. And so Jane and I were co-composers. We actually worked on different sections of the music, which would come from the 17th century all the way to modern times. And so it was a difficult thing to think about doing. I will just mention technically that came up with the idea of having a type of Big Bang moment at the beginning of the piece, which would in many ways symbolize that idea of this moment in which all of the particles are there, they just have to be organized in an appropriate way. So the entire oratorio is based on a chord, an opening sonority, which is particular, and that has all 12 pitches and all possible intervals up to an octave. So all of the material of at least European Western music is in that opening chord. And so in the example you'll hear that opening chord, but moving through the oratorio, Jane and I were able to bring all of our material from that type of chord. And in the offerings that I've done, there are examples from 18th century hornpipe fiddling to a more 19th century type of spiritual. There is a type of space age orbit music that we have. And Jane likewise was able, for the different sections of the music and the narrative that she had to set, was able to kind of draw from that chord. And the chord will come back. One of the, I think, interesting things in what I'm trying to express right now is in the little trailer that you'll see, you're going to hear both of the extremes. You're going to hear the chord, and with the material that the oratorio, if I can call it that, the event, will culminate an hour later. So you're not going to hear all the things that led to it and all the different types of styles and musical references and tunes, but you'll hear the beginning and the tail end of that.
I should also hasten to add that in addition to the performers on stage, which consists of an ensemble comprised of members of the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, led by the conductor Mark Fortune. We have two fantastic soloists, the soprano Erica Bykoff and the baritone Timothy Nelson. And in addition to the music, there's a visual component. Every one of the 9 scenes has projected images that pertain specifically to the elements of that scene. So maybe we can, and some of those images are part of this little trailer that we constructed.
I mean, it is a teaser. It's a type of,
exactly.
Yeah, but it's fun. So let's run it.
Okay.
You know, hearing that, I have to mention that in part the idea came from, for those who are aware, the opening of Igor Stravinsky's The Flood, in which he has a very similar type of opening. Of course, his music goes in a different direction, but that idea that Stravinsky himself claimed that it was like a representation of the Big Bang. I'm also reminded of the opening of Haydn's Creation, although that's a very different type of music.
Well, one of the things that I was trying to convey in the many chats that you and I and Jane had when we were planning all of this, at the time I was reading one of many biographies of Wagner, and I was particularly enthralled with the notion of an or chord, a chord that is the motivating chord of the entire work from which everything springs. So I remember we talked about that a little bit. So there are many different ways of considering this, which is part of the excitement.
Sure. So we need to acknowledge Elliott Carter too, who's an American composer, and he clearly, that was one of the culminating techniques of his, was to have these all 12 note and 12 interval chords from which all of the material would be understood as coming from in a non-linear fashion.
Right.
John,
I think there's a lot more we could do. We could speak for hours about this and continue, but we're constrained a little bit by time. And there are some really fascinating questions that have been sent in. So I think what we should do is go to the questions. Before I do, I'd like to just thank everyone for listening, remind you that our next music forum is the 9th of April. And that will be a little bit different. We're going to be tracing the wood from outside the Steinway factory that is used to build one of these beasts. We're going to trace the evolution of a particular Steinway piano from its componentry, wood in the lumberyard, to finished concert product on stage. And the one that we're talking about, the actual piano we're talking about, ended up, it's a concert grand, and it ended up on stage in the auditorium of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Our guest for that will be James Barron, who is a New York Times reporter and author. He wrote a series of articles about this, and he'll be speaking to us from New York on this topic. So let's dive right into some of these questions. We have quite a few. One I'll start with, John, this goes directly to what you were speaking about regarding fractals. Depictions of fractals in textbooks and in even nature usually involve vibrant colors. Do you happen to have synesthesia? And if so, do fractal structures in your compositions come to you as specific or shifting colors? And if so, what comes first as you write, the color or the sound? And that's from Ben in Lisbon.
Well, yes, of course, that's a great question. And that is actually having a neurological condition, that when you hear a pitch or a key, that you see a color. And it's not imagining a color. Your brain will fire that and you will actually see it. A lot of people find it a real distraction, because they can't go to a concert because they'll be just really distracted with a rainbow in their head. I do not possess that particular attribute? That's an interesting question. And I gotta be honest, I haven't really thought so much about making that connection between actual visual color with regard to how I deal with fractals, but rather texture and timbre, articulation. And for me, I think that's a more logical way of seeing different colors. So I'm thinking about often when I layer these different things, which would be done in different colors in a fractal, it's not so much the idea of, well, gosh, how do you compose color? But it would be articulation. So you might have one line that is absolutely staccato and very short, and then you have another one that's going to be a different dynamic level. You're going to have another layer that is going to be maybe very, very quiet. And so that's the way that I deal with that. But making that direct connection to color is, again, one of those areas which I think is, I have to have it move into the area of texture.
Well, and of course, Scriabin was synesthetic. And, you know, for him, this chord, F sharp major, was bright electric blue. And he used his synesthetic capabilities in some of his musical works as well. I mean, I think it's his Fifth Symphony, Prometheus, which involved a color organ, which really couldn't be done when it was written in 1911, but can be done today with lasers. So he was slightly ahead of his time in certain ways. Synesthesia comes into works of other composers as well. So it's a fascinating area. And, you know, if you can link frequencies of sound to frequencies of light, it would be, it could be quite rich. We have another question. Will Some Call at Home be live streamed as well for those who can't get to Plymouth? And that's from Julia in London. At the moment, I believe that the theater is not going to live stream. The guidelines are for a socially distanced audience, and everyone on stage will also be socially distanced. So it will be a live event only, as far as I'm aware. Let's see. John, another one for you. Have the sketches which you found with effort now been made more easily available? And there are two questions. So let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, my quartet is hot off the press. The ink is still wet. So the answer to that would really be no. This was a book that Juilliard had to acquire through an interlibrary loan, if you remember those old things in the old days. But there was no source of it online. I did get close, but it did not allow me to download. There was a strange firewall. And so I really had to go old school and get that dissertation, which had all of the sketches. But again, I find it really fascinating. There's a lot of, I think, work still to be done with regard to making a lot of this material available. I was really quite shocked when I thought I would just, you know, Google it and boom, there it would be, Google image, but So no, not quite yet, but.
Not quite yet. Some
to look forward to.
Some of Beethoven's material, you know,
absolutely.
is readily available. And it just depends. I mean, there's so much of it that you can't take anything for granted, but sometimes you can get lucky.
Yeah. But what's really interesting is it was not clear for me even to track down that dissertation. Right. It took a lot of work and false leads to really to get to that area, kind of thing that archivists and bibliographists, you know, kind of salivate about, that journey that you had to go through.
Let's see. I think we have time for, well, there's one other question. There's another part to this question, then we'll have one other question thereafter. Martin Lavelle continues to ask, in Cellular Automata, there is the game of life, where all that happens follows automatically from rules and a starting pattern. Have you tried to generate any sketches or pieces in this way?
I'm delighted by that question. In fact, my doctoral dissertation at Juilliard is a piece for violin and tape. And it's my only work that deals with a musical representation of cellular automata with the game of life. And that is interesting work. And if you know Game of Life, which I imagine you do, they're little rockets and there are all these gliders that show. And so I represented that musically in the tape part. The score is just, you know, it's monstrous. And there's another type of two-dimensional automata called the Fredkin's game, which I'm much more interested in because that will actually replicate a design as a fractal. So if you begin with a particular motive, after a few generations, you'll get 4 of those motives, and then you'll get 4 times 4. And so that I've done. But that work called Trajectories, which has never been performed, deals with the game of life, sure.
Okay, hopefully someday it will be performed. One last question. This is a sort of personal one for you, John. How do you, as a composer, listen to music? Do you listen analytically, or do you enjoy listening on the surface? And that's from Ginny in London.
It's funny, I was just talking to a colleague of mine at Juilliard with regard to this kind of topic. There are different ways that I listen to music. And, subjectivity is really a rich part of, I think, what we take in, guilt, the many multiple levels of guilty pleasure, so to speak. So I do not normally go home and make dinner while listening to the Elliott Carter Piano Concerto or even Beethoven Symphony. I would not do. However, I might put on an aria by Handel, or I might put, the other day I was listening to Cheap Trick, which is a rock group, from the 70s. So with regard to how we take in music, it's a really fascinating thing. I will find, I often will be listening to music on YouTube. We all do this, and I'll find a piece by a contemporary classical composer that might be very rich and complicated. And I bemoan the fact that I don't have the energy or time to really listen to this, but I just don't want to do it right now. So there are multiple different types of music that I listen to, and I do it in different ways. I would say one final thing is that I don't own any more CD player like many people. It's just something that we do most of this through the technology of our computers. And I do bemoan that fact because I do going out to Tower Records, which doesn't really exist anymore in America, not in New York, buying a CD, taking it home, looking at the artwork in the liner notes, and then putting it on. I found that very, very enjoyable, and it could be all types of music.
Yeah. Well, I think we all listen in different ways, and everyone has different experiences that they bring. In a certain sense, the more, I believe that the more you appreciate a piece and the way it's built and the way it's constructed, the more there is to listen to it, and vice versa. So it's a series of rich and almost unending quests for meaningful, artistic, communicative experiences. So maybe we should leave it there for now. John, thank you so much. It's great
Thank you, Bob.
to have you with us. Great to be with you.
I look forward to more adventures together.
More adventures indeed. And thank you all for being with us this evening as well. Stay well.